My husband asked for a divorce. I want everything except Jade. My lawyer would eventually beg me to fight harder. Instead, I told him, give it to Dean. The house, the business, the furniture. Every account and obligation he insisted belonged to him. At the final hearing, I would sign almost all of it away. Dean thought I'd surrendered. His lawyer wouldn't understand what I'd actually done until a judge started reading numbers out loud. But that came later. My name is Nina Brockman. I'm 54 years old, and I've been a building inspector in Franklin County, Ohio, for 28 years. My job taught me that things can look solid while they're already rotting underneath. For 24 years, I forgot the same could be true of a marriage. It was February when I finally noticed the cracks. I woke around 2 in the morning and walked toward the kitchen for water. The house was dark except for the blue glow of Dean's phone. He sat at the table, typing quickly. Then I saw the message. Can't wait to see your new place. You're going to look unstoppable. Another appeared. Once you're free of the dead weight, the real Dean can finally shine. Dead weight. Dean smiled at the screen. I backed into the hallway before he noticed me. 20 minutes later, he returned to bed and placed his phone face down. I didn't confront him. Building inspectors don't argue with damage. We document it. So I started watching. Dean had started a home staging business 10 months earlier. At first, I supported him. Then things started disappearing. The first was an Afghan my mother had crocheted before she died. Forest green with cream stripes, worth almost nothing. Priceless to me. Where's Mom's blanket? Staging job. When is it coming back? Soon. It never did. More household items followed. Dean always called it temporary. Then one night, Jade came into my room carrying her laptop. Mom, I found something weird. She opened Facebook Marketplace. There was our furniture. For sale. Under another seller name. And in one photograph, my mother's Afghan was folded across the back of a chair. He's selling our stuff? Jade nodded. The listings go back 8 months. I photographed everything. That became the first folder. Then I started checking our finances. Money was leaving our accounts for wholesalers, furniture purchases, and storage charges, while the income Dean claimed his business was generating rarely appeared. Month after month, more went out than came back. I told myself maybe Dean was simply bad at business. Then Jade's college fund statement arrived. I opened it at the kitchen counter. The balance was short. $8,000. We'd spent 15 years building that account so our daughter wouldn't begin adulthood buried in student loans. Now $8,000 was gone. The transaction line was clear. Transfer out. Authorized joint account holder. I called the investment company the next morning. They confirmed it. Authorized by Dean Brockman approximately 3 months ago. That evening, I placed the statement in front of him. We need to talk. Dean glanced down. Oh. That was his reaction. Oh, you took $8,000 from Jade's 529. The company needed liquidity. That's our daughter's college money. I'll replace it. When? He sighed. Why do you always assume the worst? Because there's $8,000 missing. It's technically our money. No, we saved it for her. Dean picked up his phone. Jade will survive. Then he said something I never forgot. That's what student loans are for. I waited for guilt. Nothing. He went back to his phone. Conversation over. I walked into the garage. Half of it was filled with Dean's staging inventory. Standing there, I finally understood what I'd been refusing to see. Dean wasn't building a successful business. He was dismantling our home to keep a failing one alive. So for the next 6 weeks, I documented everything. Transfers, withdrawals, invoices, missing furniture, and one recurring charge Dean had never mentioned, $180 a month for a storage unit. Eventually, I took the folder to Tony Mendez, my longtime friend and a CPA. He studied the numbers in silence. Finally, he looked up. Dean's business isn't an asset, Nina. It's buried in liabilities. How bad? Bad enough that if this ends in divorce, you need to understand something. He tapped the folder. If Dean takes the company, he takes its debts, taxes, contracts, and liabilities too. So ownership isn't necessarily an asset. Not when the business is sinking. Tony studied my face. You're thinking about letting him keep it. He'd probably demand it anyway. Nina, that sounds a lot like losing. I closed the folder. Only if you stop reading before the fine print. 3 weeks later, Dean asked for the divorce. Sunday morning. Breakfast. And he brought his older brother, Marcus, to watch. That told me immediately this wasn't spontaneous. Dean folded his hands. I want the house. I drank my coffee. Both vehicles. Marcus nodded. The staging company stays entirely mine. I said nothing. And I want half your retirement. Then I asked the only question that mattered. What about Jade? Dean hesitated for less than 2 seconds. You keep custody. I thought I'd misheard him. What? I don't have time to manage a teenager right now. The business is finally taking off. Marcus leaned back. Dean needs a clean start. Then he shrugged. And Jade's at that difficult age anyway. I felt something inside me go completely still. Our daughter had become an inconvenience. Then I saw movement in the hallway. Jade. She had heard everything. Her face was expressionless. That scared me more than tears would have. Wow, Dad. Dean turned. Jade. Really feeling the love. Don't make this dramatic. Her mouth twitched. This isn't about you. Jade stared at him for several seconds. No. Her voice was quiet. I guess it isn't. She walked outside. The door clicked shut. Dean looked back at me as if nothing irreversible had just happened. Marcus cleared his throat. Well? I placed my coffee down. Okay. Dean blinked. What? You can have it. Silence. Marcus sat forward. The house? Yes. The business? Yes. Dean narrowed his eyes. What are you doing? Agreeing. You're not going to fight? I stood and carried my coffee mug toward the sink. I'll call a lawyer tomorrow. Neither man spoke. For the first time that morning, Dean looked nervous. People understand anger, screaming, and threats. What terrifies them is when the person they're trying to defeat suddenly stops fighting. Dean didn't know it yet, but he'd just asked me to hand him a collapsing building, and I was going to make absolutely certain the paperwork said it belonged entirely to him. The next morning, I called Wallace Braddock. Tony had recommended him with one sentence. He's the kind of lawyer who actually reads the paperwork. Wallace had practiced family law in Franklin County for 35 years. I brought him everything. Bank statements, marketplace screenshots, the college fund withdrawal, Dean's business records. He read through the folder, then looked at me. So your husband wants the house, the business, both vehicles, and half your retirement. Yes. And you want to give him most of it. Most. I pointed to the business records. Dean wants sole ownership of the staging company. Give it to him. Assets and liabilities? Everything attached to it. The house? He can have it if my name comes off the mortgage. 90-day refinance deadline. If he can't qualify, the house gets sold. Good. The retirement? No. I'd spent 28 years building my pension. Dean wasn't getting half simply because he demanded it. And Jade? With me. I slid the college statement across the desk. And I want her $8,000 back. Wallace nodded. We can offset it against Dean's share of the marital property. Then he tapped Dean's business records. If he insists on sole ownership, the settlement needs to make one thing very clear. Sole ownership means sole responsibility. Exactly. Nina, you're not giving him a successful business. No. You're separating yourself from a failing one. That was the plan. The next month became exhausting. Dean and his attorney, Camilla Holt, sent request after request, looking for money they were convinced I had hidden somewhere. They found exactly what existed. Nothing more. At one point, Dean filed an emergency motion over an old fishing boat I'd sold for $2,800 to cover our apartment deposit. He claimed it was worth $15,000. Wallace produced the records. The judge denied the motion in 20 minutes. A week later, my employer received an anonymous complaint accusing me of taking bribes to pass building inspections. It triggered a formal investigation and put me on administrative leave for 2 weeks. They found nothing. I was reinstated. My supervisor still warned me quietly. The complaint named properties from your work calendar. Someone had access to specific information. Wallace couldn't prove Dean was responsible, so we documented it and moved on. Then Camilla contacted Wallace. Dean wanted mediation. Fast. More importantly, Dean and Camilla agreed that a forensic accounting review wasn't necessary. Wallace called me as soon as he received the waiver. They're skipping the forensic review. I looked at the folder on my kitchen table. Is that legal? They've received the disclosures. They can review whatever they want. And if they don't? That's their decision. The mediation was scheduled for late May. Dean arrived in a new suit with Marcus beside him. He looked confident, almost cheerful. Before we started, Marcus leaned toward him. Don't let her keep the retirement. That's where the real money is. Dean nodded. Camilla says I'll get half. I heard every word. I didn't react. Because that was the one thing Dean wasn't getting. The retirement split had become the hardest part of negotiations. Wallace documented my 28 years of contributions against Dean's much smaller retirement history. By mediation, the proposed division was 82% to me, 18% to Dean. Dean hated it. But he wanted the house and the business more. Wallace had predicted that. If he believes that company is his future, he'll trade long-term security to keep it. He was right. The mediator began reviewing the agreement. Dean would receive sole ownership of the staging company, all inventory, all accounts receivable, all accounts payable, all associated obligations. The house would go to Dean, subject to one condition. He had 90 days after the final decree to refinance the mortgage entirely into his own name. If he failed, the house would be sold. No extensions. My truck and tools stayed with me. The retirement accounts were divided 82-18 in my favor. I received primary custody of Jade, and the $8,000 Dean had removed from her college fund would be offset against his share of the home equity. That was what almost everything actually meant. Dean got the things he'd fought hardest to possess. I kept the things I couldn't rebuild: my pension, my livelihood, my daughter, and Jade's future. There was one more piece. Attached to the settlement were the detailed financial exhibits for Dean's business. More than 200 pages, vendor balances, business accounts, storage obligations, transactions, financial records. Everything Wallace had required us to disclose. He placed them on the table. Appendices C through F. Full supporting documentation. Camilla barely looked at them. We've reviewed the disclosures. Wallace paused. Just long enough for me to notice. Then he nodded. The mediator continued. Dean initialed each required page. He signed the acknowledgement confirming he'd received the financial disclosures. He also signed the waiver confirming he had chosen not to pursue forensic accounting. Then, he signed the settlement. I watched his pen move across the final line. No hesitation. No questions. Camilla gathered the pages. My client is prepared to finalize. Wallace slid the agreement toward me. For a moment, I thought about the last 24 years. Then I remembered Dean standing in our kitchen with Jade's college statement between us. That's what student loans are for. I signed. The mediator stamped the agreement. Settlement is executed. Dean leaned back in his chair. A small smile appeared on his face. The final hearing was scheduled for June 14th. As we stood to leave, Marcus passed behind my chair. Should have fought harder, Nina. I looked at him, then at Dean, then at the thick stack of financial exhibits sitting beside his lawyer. Maybe. Dean walked out believing he'd won the house and the company he'd sacrificed our family to build. What he hadn't understood was that the settlement didn't just determine who owned the business. It determined who owned everything attached to it. And on June 14th, a judge was going to ask whether Dean understood exactly what he'd signed. June 14th arrived. Dean walked into the courtroom believing he was there to make his victory official. He sat across from me beside Camilla, dressed in the same dark suit he'd worn to mediation. Marcus took a seat in the front row. Judge Warren reviewed the settlement in silence. Finally, he looked over his reading glasses. This appears to be a comprehensive agreement. Both parties have signed. He turned toward Dean. Mr. Brockman, do you understand and accept these terms as written? Yes, Your Honor. Then he looked at me. Mrs. Brockman? Yes, Your Honor. Wallace stood. Your Honor, for the record, the financial exhibits attached as appendices C through F are incorporated into the agreement. Camilla's head lifted. Wallace continued calmly. Those exhibits contain the supporting documentation regarding the business assets and obligations Mr. Brockman is assuming through sole ownership. Judge Warren looked at Camilla. Counsel, did you review these exhibits with your client before he signed? Silence. Camilla shifted in her chair. We reviewed the material disclosures, Your Honor. The appendices were extensive, and we relied on the summary documentation provided during discovery. The judge's expression changed. That isn't what I asked. He leaned forward. Did you review the detailed exhibits with your client? Yes or no? Camilla glanced at Dean. Dean glanced back. For the first time that morning, his confidence disappeared. Your Honor, my client signed an acknowledgement confirming receipt of the disclosed materials. The forensic accounting waiver was a mutual decision intended to expedite settlement. Judge Warren looked at Dean. Mr. Brockman, are you aware that the business you're assuming includes approximately $47,000 in outstanding vendor obligations? Dean froze. What? Camilla grabbed her copy of the settlement and started flipping through the appendices. Judge Warren continued. And approximately $6,000 in storage-related fines and obligations? Dean turned toward Camilla. You said the business debt was manageable. She didn't answer. Then she found the relevant pages. Her face changed. Judge Warren looked back down. These exhibits also contain records suggesting business income may have gone unreported across multiple tax years. Marcus shot to his feet. She set him up. Sit down, Judge Warren said. Marcus started to protest. You are not a party to these proceedings. The bailiff moved toward him. Marcus sat. Dean turned to Camilla. You told me everything was fine. His voice had gone thin. You told me we'd reviewed everything. The appendices were extensive, Camilla said quietly. We relied on the disclosures and summaries during discovery. You told me we didn't need forensic accounting. We made a judgment call. Dean stared at her. Then he looked across the courtroom at me. You knew how bad this was. Wallace answered calmly. Everything was disclosed. Dean's eyes stayed on mine. You knew, and you let me sign. You wanted sole ownership. I didn't understand how bad it was. You signed an acknowledgement saying you'd received the financial documentation. I didn't read 200 pages. Judge Warren cut in. Mr. Brockman. Dean stopped. The judge turned to Camilla. Did you advise your client to waive detailed forensic review? Camilla swallowed. Yes, Your Honor, but... And did your client sign an acknowledgement that he was assuming sole ownership and responsibility for the business assets and obligations identified in these exhibits? Yes, Your Honor. She hesitated. But this isn't how we understood the business valuation. Judge Warren looked directly at her. Counsel, the exhibits are part of the agreement your client signed. Camilla went silent. Wallace remained standing. The appendices were properly labeled, timely disclosed, and available to opposing counsel before mediation. Their signed waiver of forensic accounting is also in the record. Judge Warren looked through several pages. Then he set them down. The time to examine the financial condition of an asset is before your client agrees to assume sole ownership of it. Dean's shoulders dropped. I find no basis to set aside this agreement. The judge turned toward him. You have assumed sole ownership of the staging business and the associated liabilities identified in the settlement. Dean stared at the table. You have also agreed to refinance the marital residence within 90 days of the final decree. If you fail to do so, the property will be listed for sale. A long silence followed. Do you understand? Dean barely managed it. Yes, Your Honor. The agreement is entered. The gavel came down. That was it. 24 years of marriage reduced to signatures, exhibits, and one sharp crack of wood. Camilla immediately began gathering papers. Dean didn't move. Marcus hurried toward him. "Will appeal." Wallace closed his folder. "On what grounds?" This was an ambush. "No," Wallace said. "It was disclosure." Marcus opened his mouth. Wallace continued. "Failure to read documents that were properly provided isn't grounds for appeal." He glanced toward Camilla. "If Mr. Brockman believes he received inadequate legal advice, that's a separate conversation." I left before anyone could say anything else. Jade was waiting in the hallway. She looked up from her phone. "How'd it go?" "Your dad got what he wanted." She studied my face. "That bad?" "Pretty bad." Then I remembered something. "Oh, and your $8,000. She stopped. "What about it?" "You're getting it back." Her eyes widened. "Seriously?" "Offset against Dean's equity in the house. Your college fund gets restored." For a second, she just stared at me. Then she laughed. A real laugh. The first one I'd heard from her in months. "Mom, that's actually insane." The consequences came one deadline at a time. Dean had 90 days to refinance the house. His business debts and unpaid obligations made refinancing nearly impossible. 3 lenders rejected him. On day 87, he called asking for another 90 days. I forwarded the voicemail to Wallace. Dean didn't get an extension. The refinance deadline expired, and under the settlement, the house had to be sold. After the mortgage, overdue expenses, fees, and Jade's $8,000 offset, Dean walked away with very little. Within 4 months, strangers were living in the house we'd spent most of our marriage in. The business followed. Creditors pursued unpaid balances. Some staging inventory was seized. Then came the tax notices, requests for records and questions about income that didn't match what had been reported. The financial mess Dean had fought to own was now entirely his responsibility. Eventually, he moved in with Marcus. I didn't ask for details. Dean's life wasn't my structure to inspect anymore. Our 2-bedroom apartment wasn't impressive, but it was quiet. Jade and I built new routines: Saturday pancakes, Wednesday spaghetti, homework at the kitchen table. No missing furniture. No secret withdrawals. No one treating her like an inconvenience. She finished sophomore year on the honor roll. 8 months after the hearing, I found her sitting at the table with textbooks spread around her. She looked up. "Mom?" "Yeah?" "Do you think Dad gets it yet?" "Gets what?" "That he lost." I thought about the question. Dean had wanted the house. Gone. He'd wanted the business. Collapsed. He'd wanted freedom from responsibility. Instead, he'd inherited every responsibility attached to the thing he valued most. But that wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was Sunday morning. Breakfast. Dean saying he didn't have time for his own daughter. I sat across from Jade. "I don't think your dad sees it that way." "Why?" "Because some people think losing means somebody beat them." She waited. "Sometimes nobody has to beat you." I looked around our little apartment. "You just have to be allowed to make your own choices." Jade smiled faintly. "So you really did give him what he wanted?" "Almost." She laughed. And that was the part Dean never understood. I didn't win because I took everything from him. I won because I protected the few things that actually mattered. My pension, my livelihood, my daughter, and Jade's future. Everything else? Dean could have it. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stop fighting someone for what they're demanding. Step aside. Let them take it. And make sure the paperwork says it's theirs.